Yes. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to our The Assault Podcast Listening Club. My name is Selena Alvarez, and I'm the Associate Director at Empower Yolo. I want to welcome everybody to the Listening Club and thank everyone for being here. For the month of April, we are celebrating Sexual Assault Awareness Month, and so we are highlighting a podcast that was created by CAP Radio entitled After the Assault. So today we'll be discussing episodes 2 and 3. And we have a wonderful panelist of sexual assault response team members here, and I'll have them introduce themselves. So Jen Vasquez.
Good afternoon, everybody. So my name is Jen Vasquez, and I am on the care advocate team here at Yolo, Empower Yolo, and that stands for Concerned Advocates Responding to Emergencies. So, yeah.
Great. Thank you, Jen.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Jess, Lucia.
Hi, everyone. I am Empower Yolo's sexual assault advocate, and I'm also a part of the care team.
Great. Toni Diaz.
Hi, my name is Toni Diaz. I'm a detective with the City of Davis Police Department.
Great. Stacy Helliker.
I'm Stacy Helliker. I'm the medical director for the BEAR program. BEAR stands for Bridging Evidence Assessment and Resources, and we do all of the sexual assault exams for Sacramento and Yolo counties. I've been a nurse examiner since 1997.
Wow. Thank you, Stacy. Elizabeth Seeley.
Hi, I am a nurse at Sutter Davis Emergency Department, and I'm also the lead coordinator for our Victim Intervention for Violence and Abuse program, which is about 4 years old now.
Wonderful. We'll learn more about that. And then Cecilia Lopez.
Hello, I am the CAC program manager at the Yolo County MDIC. We are the Children's Advocacy Center of Yolo County.
Wonderful. All right. So last week we had the episode entitled Start by Believing. And the episode talked about the importance of shifting our framework when working with survivors. So, Toni, can you tell us more about how Davis PD uses this information and framework when working with survivors of sexual assault?
Yeah, so typically when someone becomes a police officer, they go to the police academy and they may take additional training. They're usually taught throughout their training that they want to get kind of like the old police that you would see depicted in media, where I just want the facts. Give me the time, the place, the what happened, the description, and I want to get that information out to maybe other officers that are responding as quickly as possible. As they move to take a more traditional report, they would really be trying to elicit information from whomever they're talking to typically in a chronological fashion. So I want to know from kind of when this started to when it ended, and please tell me the story in as it occurred along the way, kind of linearly in time. And so when we look at working with survivors of sexual assault and their reporting, it doesn't work that way typically. It's typically very different. So, people's memories that have gone through traumatic experiences are changed, sometimes permanently, sometimes temporarily. And so we really ask them to tell us what they remember at the time, and however it comes to them, however that memory is triggered. There are different techniques to sort of elicit that information. A couple of years ago, I went through some training for sexual assault investigations, and at that time they were using more of a sensory type interview style. So tell me what you remember smelling, tell me what you remember feeling, tell me what you remember hearing. I've used that technique. It works really well. There are other techniques out there. One that's often referred to as FETI, the forensic interviewing type. So it really kind of depends, but I think the main thing is really just interviewing survivors and understanding that their memory may be fragmented. They may remember bits and pieces. Memories may come to them in the future. They may come at surprising times. And so from a law enforcement perspective, being open and willing to accept that additional information as the survivor reports it to you, however they choose to report it to you.
Wonderful. So Cecilia, I want to talk to you and ask you how the interview center uses this framework as well. So can you tell us how the MDIC interviewers are trained to use trauma-informed interviewing techniques to support survivors? And maybe just tell us a little bit about who the center interviews and why it's created.
So our center, like I mentioned, is a children's advocacy center. So we primarily work with victims that are under the age of 18. We do forensic interviews for both child welfare services and law enforcement. And, our interviewers do neutral, forensically sound interviews after going through several types of training. They follow a 10-step model, which is mostly asking, the WH questions, like no non-leading questions, no, no yes or no questions. So it's like, tell me more about that. And, what happened, tell me the story, like rather, allowing the victims to kind of narrate their own story versus asking specific direct questions. They're constantly taking trainings in trauma and how to answer these questions in a trauma-informed way. They go through several child forensic interview trainings prior to starting the interviews. They do about a week first, and then they have to go through and do about 2 years of interviews. And then they are allowed to take the child forensic interview training, the second part of it, which is another week of training where they conduct mock interviews and, train with other forensic interviewers. They also do peer review every several months, where they meet with other interviewers across the state and, kind of review each other's interviews and give each other feedback. So yeah, our interviewers are in constant training.
Wonderful. And so they're interviewing children following allegations of sexual abuse and providing a safe, non-institutional setting to conduct those interviews as well.
Yes, and the main purpose of a children's advocacy center is to reduce the number of times that kids are interviewed when any types of allegations arise. So prior to having a children's advocacy center in Yolo County, kids were getting interviewed on average about 11 times by different agencies. Ideally, we would only interview a child once prior, when the allegation comes up, prior to them getting to the court and criminal process of it. Unfortunately, that doesn't always happen, but the number has, been reduced drastically. From kids no longer get interviewed 11 times. I mean, we try to have them come in once, and occasionally they may have to come in a second time, but we really try to avoid even that.
Right. And part of the reduction of interviews are because the interviews are being observed by multiple parties that need to know that information. So law enforcement, child welfare services, district attorney's office. And so that the team is able to hear the information to figure out how to best move forward with the case.
Yes, we have all of the service providers and anybody that's involved in these cases, observing the interviews, listening in, and directing questions to our interviewers through an earpiece. So, everybody that needs to know the information at once is sitting in one place, rather than having the child go to separate service providers to share their story.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cecilia.
I also forgot to mention, we also do see developmentally delayed adults. So, we have had several of those cases in Yolo County that have involved that population. So that population is also serviced at our center.
Okay, so some adults can receive an interview through the interview center.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Jess, can you talk about how Start by Believing and that knowledge and framework, how that impacts your work with survivors?
Yeah, so really Start by Believing and the campaign is really an amazing thing. So it impacts my work when I go in and I accompany to law enforcement interviews or at the MDIC. I get not a lot, but some survivors say they don't feel like they were believed just because of the process and all the questions, and like Cecilia was saying, the non-leading questions, and also the follow-up questions. So for me as an advocate, making sure that they do know that they're believed, and also being really thorough with the process of everything and why certain things are happening and why they have to ask follow-up questions, things along those lines. The brain and trauma is such a complex thing. And I see Amy shaking her head. she knows. And it's just really important to normalize the way a survivor is feeling, maybe some of the actions the survivor is doing, or the survivor not remembering certain things, and just letting them know that that's normal and that's okay. Some memory might come back, some might not, and that's totally normal as well. And just really explaining that to them and letting them know that it's normal and that they have support, and that they are believed. So,
wonderful. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, Elizabeth, we know that many survivors may present first to an emergency room following a sexual assault. Can you tell us what Sutter Davis Emergency Room is doing to train medical staff and how they're able to support survivors? And can you share a little bit about the Green Dot campaign?
Yes, so as I mentioned, what we call VIVA, Victim Intervention for Violence and Abuse, is about 4 years old. And initially it was going to be just an education campaign, because really the first step is, awareness and then education. And then from that, going to implementation, some process changes. And then where we're trying to go to still is having a standard expectation and then being able to hold accountable to that expectation. And I don't know if you remember this, but when we did our initial trainings that Empower Yolo was involved in, Davis PD, the DA's office, you would use the word trauma-informed care, expecting that we all knew what that was. And it was foreign to all of us. We're thinking trauma like car accidents, gunshot wounds, that's trauma. And so the term trauma-informed care wasn't something any of us had been educated to, much less implemented. So even just knowing what, trauma brain, how the brain works under traumatic experiences is one thing we teach to every single new employee. We do in-person training, even through most of the pandemic, because the online learnings, people just blank out, they don't, we have so many, probably like 80 to 100 a year online courses. So we do try to make it something more robust than that. And then Sutter also now has an ED transitions course for all nurses. And this isn't just Sutter Davis, this is from the Bay Area to Roseville, where if you're new to the ER, you go through a training program specific for ER nurses. And I get to go and teach now to the region some basic information, including trauma-informed care. You asked about the Green Dot campaign. So there's intent versus what's actually happened with that. So the Green Dot campaign was basically trying to make an easy way for patients to disclose abuse of any kind, whether it's sexual assault, domestic violence. And in our restrooms, when you give samples for urine, there's a graphic that says, are you safe? Do you feel like you can leave your home? Has anyone hurt you? If so, use one of these green stickers, put it on your urine cup. And it's been really interesting because Sutter, Sacramento has had disclosures that way. And across the nation, it has. In our hospital, the stickers go missing all the time. They're completely gone frequently when we've had very actual little success with that. So we've had high hopes for it. And we were actually, my assistant manager emailed me, said, we have got to do something different. We cannot keep these stickers up. We're not getting the disclosures that other facilities are having success with. So we're actually going to try and revamp that and make it so that the stickers can't go missing, and that we might make individualized packs or something like that. But that's TBD, but that's what that is supposed to be.
I think it is important though, as a way for safely for somebody to be able to reach out for help. And what are ways that you if you do get a disclosure in the emergency room department, can you talk about what your process is to support those survivors and connect them to any services that they may be needing?
Yes, so one of the big things that we heard from survivors was that there's no way to disclose if we're not alone. You know, not necessarily not having a support person, but a lot of times they may present with the person who has victimized them. And so we changed our visitor policy to always bring a patient back alone initially, so that we can give them that area for privacy to try and increase disclosures. So that's one very big change. And then after that, we have everything from, of course, Empower Yolo or other agencies, depending on what county the patient lives in. And we've really, I think, fostered that relationship a lot. And so we will call advocates as long as the patient's okay with it. If it's going to be a mandated report or they want to report, obviously calling law enforcement. And then the nurse's role, what we're trying to do is the privacy portion. And then also being advocates ourselves, because as Toni kind of mentioned, the training for interviews has changed a lot over the years. And some officers are still doing the linear, like, what happened next, and kind of casting doubt if the answer's not there. You know, I've been in some of those interviews. They're like, well, she doesn't even remember what restaurant it was, or, you know, language like that. So we're now training the nurses to kind of stand up and say, hey, my understanding is that's pretty normal. Let's let her continue with her story. And I've been in rooms when that's happened before too.
Toni, can you talk about what options survivors have when reporting to the Davis Police Department?
Yeah, so in police work, everything is kind of governed by the law and by policy. And so our policy, which really closely follows the Yolo County protocol for sexual assault investigations, gives survivors kind of four formal options, but it's not necessarily tied to those. So just kind of verbatim for the policy, survivors can do an information only report where that's just it. There's no criminal investigation. A survivor comes in, or we call them, or however they wish to convey the information to us, and we just take their information, and that's it. The report just gets suspended basically at that point. They can do a partial investigation where the survivor may choose to just have us do some part of the formal criminal investigation, but it may stop from, say, interviewing the suspect, or it may stop from sending the completed report to the district attorney for review. So it's really up to the survivor. We can do the complete investigation, which is kind of your sort of traditional law and order SVU type investigation, not solved in an hour, unfortunately, but where we go from meeting with the survivor to the point of sending the case to the district attorney for their review. They can also do anonymous reporting, where we essentially just record the information that they want us to provide us, and we keep their identity anonymous as well. So it's a fairly broad sort of set of formal options, but the one thing I really want to emphasize is that we try to be very survivor focused. So, you know, kind of from a procedural justice perspective, justice looks differently to different people. And so we want to be responsive to what the survivor wants. And so that may mean, if that means coming in and just having a conversation with an advocate present and with a detective, that's okay. If it means we'll do that partial investigation and then we'll stop and then we'll pick it up again 2 years later or whenever, when they feel comfortable, that's fine too. We really want to try and give agency back to the survivor as much as possible. And so we let them pick.
Right. And so they're presented with options reporting a sexual assault. They don't need to know what these options are, because I imagine most people will not. So you're able to talk to them and give them some choice and voice in that matter.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of depends. Like people come in and report in different ways. So they may be at Sutter Hospital, and a patrol officer may get called sort of in that emerging case where someone went to the hospital because they're concerned about an STI or because there was actual physical trauma, or they may think that that's a place where they can get a sexual assault forensic exam. at that case, it's that traditional patrol officer going out and what we call minimal disclosure, getting enough information to believe whether or not there's reasonable suspicion that a crime has occurred, and then also to potentially authorize that forensic exam. Survivors also approach us in a lot of different ways. I get calls from advocates. We get people that walk into the front counter of the police department and speak to a patrol officer. So it's really across the board, and how we approach that kind of varies depending on that time frame, and then also what the survivor conveys to us they would like to see happen.
And one thing I'll just want to clarify is, so emergency room department staff are mandated to report adult sexual assault, as well as adult sexual assault, if they see an injury that's consistent with the crime or the trauma. So there may be patients who go to the emergency room and don't know that they're mandated. They're also mandated, of course, for child abuse as well. So sometimes law enforcement is called out when somebody may not be ready for that. And Empower Yolo can provide an emergency response. We have an on-call team who can respond 24/7, 365 days a week, to hospitals, to the Bear Clinic, to law enforcement interviews, as well as to the child advocacy centers. So it's just really important that folks know what other agencies' requirements and limitations are. Elizabeth.
Yeah, so as far as the mandated reporter, that's exactly right. By law, if a patient comes to us with a physical condition related to a long litany of crimes, sexual assault included, by law, we do have to report. So what we're trying to train to, and what I try to do in my personal practice, is letting that patient know up front, I want you to know I'm a mandated reporter. So the things that you tell me, I do have to convey to law enforcement. And so sometimes I'll even say, if you want to tell me your story and leave out the name or location, because we hear a lot that they don't want to, affect anybody's life in a negative way, especially in the drug facilitated rapes where their memory is so fuzzy. And a lot of victims have a lot of concern that they're going to say the wrong thing, the wrong person's going to get in trouble. So it is also letting the patient know, then leave that part out. Whatever you want reported is what you need to tell me, and nothing more.
And one of the rights that survivors have is whether or not they want to talk with law enforcement. So just because law enforcement is called out, they still have a right whether or not they want to talk with law enforcement and give them any information. And so there is, again, still some control that survivors have when those requests are made.
Exactly. And so a lot of times when speaking with dispatch, I will let them know that the patient is not interested in seeing face-to-face law enforcement. And to be honest, that sometimes they say, okay, and sometimes someone shows up and I don't always know when. So we just do then let the patient know, law enforcement is here. You're absolutely allowed to talk or decline talking. You do not have to do anything. And that does bring relief for that patient population that's maybe A, just unsure, or B, had a negative experience in the past, and to let them know that they are in control of that interaction and they're not going to be forced to do anything.
So episode 3, we hear about the importance of evidence in investigations. So they also talk a lot about sexual assault exams, but they also talk about the importance of other types of evidence that law enforcement can get. Yes, the bear exam, as we call it locally, is one piece of the pie, but there are many other pieces of the pie, the investigation that can be done. So Stacy, episode 3 again talks a lot about these exams. I even hear the word invasive used when they talk about exams. Can you tell us what strategies you use to support survivors to help them through the process of the sexual assault exam?
Sure. I think the most important piece is the advocates that are with us. So we make sure that the advocates have been notified We ask law enforcement not to ask the patient if they want an advocate present, because a lot of times they don't think they do, because they're worried that we may be getting somebody out of bed. It may, or they may not want a stranger in the room with them. So we ask them to just say an advocate will meet you at the Bear Clinic. And I like to introduce the advocates, have them talk. They can offer services. There's so much they can do. And then the patient has the right to have the advocate there or not. Every patient who's met the advocate has never turned him or her away. They are always happy. They're very specially trained. They're warm. They can offer all the creature comforts. So, you know, they give them food and snacks and water and teddy bears and blankets. And so it makes the process a little bit easier for the patient. You know, like Elizabeth said, we're mandated reporters as healthcare providers, but the advocates are not. So, and I make sure that they know that the advocate has complete confidentiality, which I think is helpful as well. When we go over the exams at the very beginning, we make sure that they know that I need their consent. So they can consent to all of the exam, they can consent to a portion, they can change their mind, they can stop the exam. I let them know that I'll go as fast as I can, but tell me if they want me to slow down or if they need a break. All of that is okay. I'm not going to force anybody to do anything. Primarily, you know, what we focus on first is the medical piece, because we're healthcare providers first. We're not just CSIs. So we do a complete physical exam first. We want to make sure that they're okay. We do use the 923 form. I know they talked about that in the podcast. And that the 923 form is electronic. And as we go through that, it does seem a little bit linear and can seem a little bit cold. But when we collect the samples, we explain everything what we're doing, and samples are collected depending on the history that they give us. In terms of trauma-informed care, what I have found is we can be of great assistance, because as we're going through the exam, we might be touching part of their body, and sometimes even a touch can jog their memory. For instance, I had a patient who said there were no weapons. And when I touched her shoulder, because it looked like it hurt her, she said, "Oh my gosh, I remember he did have a knife, and he put it in my shirt and said that I needed to take my shirt off." And so I looked at the shirt, and sure enough, there's a tiny little incision. But just that touch that she didn't remember before that time, you know, jogged her memory. We're very respectful. The patient is never disrobed in front of everybody. We drape everything. The advocate's usually behind the curtain, especially for the more sensitive parts. The patient that walks in the room, the exam room, is not the same patient that walks out. They're usually, I've never had a patient be sorry they had an exam, but I have had plenty of people who call and they're very sorry that they did not. So I think that exams in themselves are healing. I think it's maybe the first step in their healing. We're conscious even of the language that we use. So we don't say, you know, get up in the bed. It's like, get up on the table. We don't call them sheets. They are drapes. They're not stirrups, they're footrests. I mean, those kind of things seem small, but that can be really triggering to somebody if we use anything that could be associated with a sexual act. Invasive, that's always interesting. I've had officers come in and they say, yeah, we told them how invasive it's going to be and how painful it's going to be, but they're still willing to do this exam. No, it shouldn't be painful. You know, even our pelvic exams, I think that's probably the invasive part that they're talking about. For those of you who've had a pelvic exam, it's not fun, but we're very good at what we do, and we talk people through it so that they're relaxed, and the advocate is there and puts their arm around the curtain and they can hold hands if they want to. But we go very slow, and I think it's more comfortable than a PAP exam. We're not actually scraping the cervix, but we are gathering samples from the fluid that's inside the vagina. So I think that's the invasive part that they're talking about.
And it's also that's one of the shorter pieces of the exam, right? An exam can be 2 or 3 hours, but the pelvic part, is maybe 5 or 10 minutes. And there is a lot of fear around that part, and we do, as advocates, support them as much as possible. Children, that part is not required, right? So kids, promise no owies, no, nothing should be hurting them. There's no shot, anything like that is another way to support children. But Jen, can you talk about, as an advocate, how you support survivors through the sexual assault exam?
Yeah, so victims are already coping with the trauma and anticipating like the exam itself. So as an advocate, we go in there and just provide them like with emotional support. That's my first most important thing for them, and just reassuring them that that I'm there for them during the process, and if they have any questions or anything in regards to how, like, kind of piggybacking off what Stacy was talking about, just letting them know that they can stop at any time, just making them feel as comfortable as possible, providing them with a bear, like she said, in a warm blanket, just to kind of make them feel more at ease and whatnot. Providing emotional support, like I said, guidance, as well as information for survivors so they can access help through their healing process. And then just give, like letting them know about like their victims' rights and options and other choices that they have.
Great, thank you. Toni, to answer the question in the chat, there's a question around mandated reporting of children. Power Yolo advocates are not mandated reporters for child abuse either. Where advocates are not listed in the penal code as mandated reporters, and our policy in practice is to follow those guidelines. I'm sorry, my computer is overheating, so I'm gonna mute myself in just a second. So the next question, I'll speak up, is for, Toni. This episode talks about the difficulty of identifying bruising for Black and Brown survivors. What types of guidance do you offer to survivors whose injuries might not show up immediately?
Yeah, so we have here at Davis PD, we have an evidence response team where several members on the team are trained in forensic photography. So they've gone through a week-long course that's taught by the Department of Justice. And that training includes how to photograph injuries to people. We have, we have a couple different 35mm cameras with different filters on them. And then we also have what's known as an ALS, or an alternate light source, where we can take a survivor into a dark room and then use that alternate light source at different wavelengths to kind of experiment in trying to illuminate any injuries they might have, and to be able to photograph them using those lenses and those filters to really show and capture the bruising that may not be visible under typical daylight, but may through the ALS, through illumination through the ALS, really show up in contrast with their skin tones. And so we would encourage them to come back. Usually it depends on the person, but usually come back within a couple of days after that bruising may be more present and more visible under that ALS than, say, shortly after any physical injuries might have occurred.
Thank you, Toni. Elizabeth, we know that survivors may present at the hospital for medical treatment. Can you talk about what options survivors have when they present to the emergency room?
Yes, so survivors come to the emergency room for a variety of reasons. Sometimes it's a lack of knowing where to disclose. Sometimes it's because of a physical injury. Sometimes it's looking for the evidentiary exam. In our area, again, most of the exams go to the Bear Center. And by our area, I mean Northern California. There's a couple forensic centers, but for Yolo County, Sac County, I believe El Dorado and Placer, I think they all go to the Bear Center. Is that right, Stacey?
El Dorado does, and we're back up for Placer.
Oh, okay. And so there's a lot of misunderstanding around where you can even go to get one. A lot of people think you can get an exam in the emergency room. And so we provide primarily the medical care. And then that could be anything from a physical injury that needs, suturing, say, if there's a laceration, to if they are concerned about a sexually transmitted disease. And so we can do those portions. And if that's all the patient is looking for, we can certainly do that. And then from there, we do contact an advocate. We do the portion of the mandated reporting when it's required and the patient or the patient wants us to. And then we help to coordinate along with the police department for the evidentiary exam. And again, there's either the one that the law enforcement approves, or if they don't want to work with law enforcement, considering the VAWA exam, which is it's very specific when you can get that done, but it is an option for portions of the patient population.
So if a survivor doesn't have any major medical needs to be treated, Stacy, is it recommended that they go to the emergency room, or are they able to contact the Bear Clinic more immediately to avoid an emergency room visit?
So if the exam is authorized, or if this is a VAWA exam, if they're not ready to talk to law enforcement, once they're in the clinic, we can assess for injury. We may send them back to the emergency department afterwards, or even then, if the emergency department is more suitable for whatever the injury is. If they're bleeding quite a bit, if they're hemorrhaging, if they had loss of consciousness, if they're confused, those kinds of things need to be looked at in the emergency department. If they've been strangled and they're having trouble breathing, we'd send them right back to the emergency department for further evaluation to be medically cleared. Because we're a clinic, we're an off-site clinic, we're not in the hospital, which is advantageous for patients. I think it's a lot more comfortable and a lot less stressful, but we're not equipped to deal with serious medical injuries.
All right, thank you.
Just to clarify, I think you're saying yes. So if a survivor is only interested in an exam, no, they don't have to present to the ER. And again, actually, we wouldn't be able to do that. So if it's only an exam interest, then we will help them either we'll contact Bear Center for them, or law enforcement, again, depending on the situation. But no, the ER is not a necessary step if there's not a physical injury.
Yeah, and I think you were right, Elizabeth. A lot of people think that the emergency department anywhere is the one to do the evidentiary exam, and that's not the case.
Thank you for clarifying that. So we also hear in this episode about the critical nature of analyzing evidence that's collected from the sexual assault kits. The legal timeframes for processing exams require the kits to be submitted within 20 days to the crime lab and analyzed within 120 days. For Yolo County, we use the Department of Justice Crime Lab. They do work hard to analyze the data before that 120 days. There was a new bill that just passed that is going to be developing a survivor portal where survivors can get updates on the status of their kits. And we're excited to see that platform launch soon. So we talked a little bit about the VAWA exam, but Stacy, can you talk a little bit about a VAWA exam and how Bear supports survivors when they may not be ready to involve law enforcement, and how you can collect evidence now so they can decide later?
One of the things with the VAWA exam, part of the consent process is making sure that they know that by not talking to law enforcement and by not working with them at that point, there may be evidence that could be lost. Perhaps at the scene, the law enforcement loses the ability to talk to people right then who may have been witnesses or witnesses surrounding that. They may not be available in the future. They lose the ability to even collect samples from the assailant if they go this route, because we're only collecting samples from the patient. That the advocate is still there, and we offer everything else as in the other types of exams. For instance, we still are offering STD and pregnancy prevention medications. It's important to know that we do not do STD testing. We'll test for pregnancy, but we don't do STD testing, nor do we recommend it immediately after an assault, because it takes 10 to 14 days minimum for gonorrhea, chlamydia to even be present, to be detectable for by a test. So we just offer prevention, so then they don't have to worry about it. They don't have to come back for testing. We treat for gonorrhea, chlamydia, trichomoniasis. We offer HIV prevention medication, and then Plan B or Ella. I wanted also just to, Toni was talking about bruising. And one of the things that we document is tenderness, because when we touch somebody and it's ow, we document that area was tender, because even though we may not be able to see that bruise, tenderness indicates that there's trauma to that area. So we're able to do that and touch their bodies in ways probably law enforcement is unable to do.
That's a really, really great point, right?
Mm-hmm.
I appreciate you saying that. Toni, can you just talk about what Davis PD does when they learn about a VAWA exam?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on a case-by-case basis. In some cases, someone sought out a VAWA exam because they didn't want to work with law enforcement, and oftentimes that's documented in a police report. Not a report that went and spoke with the survivor, but maybe an officer spoke with someone at the hospital or someone at the Bear Center. So if it's documented that the survivor clearly didn't want to work with law enforcement, then we may do nothing with it other than to note that we have evidence stored in our evidence room for that particular person. In other cases, if it's more ambiguous, then we may take a very soft approach. I may reach out to an advocate and ask them to just let the survivor know that should they choose their mind and want to work with law enforcement, they can reach out to contact me. In the past, I typically won't contact the survivor directly. I may send them a text message and just say, I understand you don't want to work with law enforcement. Here's a photo of my business card. Should you change your mind, let me know, and just leave it at that.
Thank you. One thing, that I don't think folks realize is, even though they may not want to involve law enforcement, the Bear Clinic will still need to contact the law enforcement agency in the jurisdiction where the crime occurred, because they need a case number in order to submit the kit to the crime lab. So it may be a Jane Doe report or something like that. And that's how law enforcement is getting information that a VAWA exam has occurred. If there is an injury and Stacy or her team are required to report that, that's also another way the law enforcement agency is notified. So while victims have a right to have an exam without law enforcement being involved, because of the way the evidence is collected and analyzed, it is still something VAWA exams still require law enforcement to be notified. It's just a matter of exactly how it's documented in their system, whether it's anonymous or something else.
We do cover that during the exam, and it's also important to tell the patient that we're not going to call them during the exam. We'll call them afterwards and after they've left, and we make sure that they know they don't have to talk to law enforcement, even if law enforcement shows up on their doorstep.
And as advocates, we also inform them of these rights and try to prepare them for the next steps and let them know that we can be available to support at any time. All right, so Cecilia, can you talk about how you at the center, how you guys support children and families following a forensic interview?
Sorry, I'm trying to figure out my microphone. As far as support services for the families while they're there, is that what you're asking?
While they're there and then after the interview as well.
Okay, so while they're there, while the children are being interviewed, we usually have them meet with an Empower Yolo, have the parents meet with an Empower Yolo advocate who kind of walks them through the process of what these investigations are like. And then they also offer support services to the family. Following the interview, we do often get questions about like the status of their cases and, you know, what happened to their case, is it going to be charged, etc. So I actually share the frustration that was shared during the podcast about not being able to get an update on some of these cases. However, for us, because we are under the umbrella of the Yolo County District Attorney's Office, we actually have access to some of that information. So we're able to either reach out to the deputy district attorneys working the cases to ask for an update and inquire about one. And we also have access to their database. So we are able to at least know where in the process the case is. We don't necessarily always update the family. I usually give that information to maybe the advocate, so you guys can reach out to them and be able to support them, you know, with the status of the case. We usually also try to really encourage law enforcement to follow up with the families, because we know that is a really frustrating part of their case. I know for them it's also difficult. I mean, they have a gazillion other cases going on, right? But it's, you know, it's something that we're continuously working on and trying to be better at updating families. I apologize, my dog is going crazy. So yeah, so that's kind of, and mainly the support that we try to give. Let me turn my microphone off.
One of the other things, and Cecilia, jump in if you're able to, the center also has a monthly case review where the partners involved are invited to present cases that they want to ensure families are receiving support services. And the team of the members, whoever they might be, law enforcement or child welfare services, the advocate, the district attorney, mental health is available. They're able to discuss the cases and ensure that families are getting connected to services and not falling through the cracks. It can be very difficult to navigate the systems that might be involved, and so we want to make sure that families are being able to access the services that are available to them.
I also wanted to add, now that my dog is a little quiet, that we really encourage the sexual assault response team members to add cases to our case review. So if you guys have encountered a case that, you know, even if they haven't gone through the MDI process yet, I feel sometimes it's helpful to discuss to determine whether an interview is even the next step for a case. You know, we have had a lot of those cases where, especially with the younger kids, where if the disclosure didn't come directly from the child that made the report, they may not be ready to come forward and talk about it. And so in some of those cases, we really try to connect the family with other services such as therapy, and then maybe have the children participate in that for a few months or a few sessions. You know, every child is different. And then we are able to check back in with the therapist or with the family to see where in the process of healing in that sense the family is, and then possibly kind of work the case a little bit, you know, backwards. Have them go through therapy first and then bring them back and do the interview and anything else that may be needed for the criminal part of the case.
And so are families or children eligible to receive therapy services from the interview center as well?
Yes, we are actually very fortunate to have a therapist on site at our center. You know, as I initially mentioned, a children's advocacy center is basically a one-stop shop. So we're fortunate to have several different disciplines of people working within our building. One of them is the therapist. So she does get, I think the majority of the referrals that come through our office end up, at least she reviews the case and, you know, determines whether or not therapy through her is something that she can do. However, we only have one for all of our kids. So that's, you know, it limits the amount of patients that she can see, but yeah, we definitely have her there. She's also available for crisis intervention when needed. Sometimes we have kids that, you know, when they come into the interview, they get very triggered by the interview, understandably so. It's a difficult conversation to have. And so if she's available and she's there, she will meet with the kids to kind of process a little bit of what just happened, and then kind of get them started, either connected to another therapist or initiate services with her. And all of these services are actually at no cost to the family. Anything that happens at the Children's Advocacy Center is at no cost to them. I do get those questions sometimes from parents like, I need a ride to the center. Do I have to pay for that? No, you don't have to pay anything. It's all part of the services that we offer to the community.
Wonderful. All right, Jen, what are some ways that Empower Yolo supports survivor who may not be ready to move forward with involve the criminal justice system?
Well, we don't pressure them. So, we just kind of just support them in what decision that they want to make. We give them their options and let them know that what their choices are for that. But services that we do provide for them, we let them know that our services here at Empower Yolo are free and they're confidential. So, that's like with the counseling and like our support group that we have. And just basically, like I said, just kind of walking through them and letting them know like what their options are. Like if they're ready to report, that, we're there for them and we'll just be, for them through the process of them doing that.
Mm-hmm. Great. And Jess, can you tell us about how advocates follow up with survivors and how we support them, whether it's through the criminal justice process or not?
Yeah, so we typically like to do follow-up calls within 3 business days. So that's follow-up calls from either the MDIC, law enforcement interview, or even the bear clinic. And after that initial incident and then the follow-up call, we can get a better idea of what they're needing and wanting. So we have things at Empower Yolo. All of our services are free. We have therapy, we have counseling, I already said that, support groups, things along those lines. And then also, I think the 2 things that have been extremely helpful just in my experience with working with survivors is the accompaniment and the information. So getting them more information on their case, whether that's talking to law enforcement or victim services, whether that is, finding out the status of their case and figuring those types of things out. And also the accompaniment has been a huge thing. So we can accompany to court, we can accompany to the MDIC, law enforcement, things along those lines. And then also Cal VCB is really important as well. So that's a compensation type victim program that helps with things like therapy, home security improvements, things along those lines. So we also help with that. But the initial follow-up call will kind of go over all of that more. And then they can say what they want, what they need, things like that.
Wonderful. So for Empower Yolo, we can work with survivors regardless of what stage they are in the process. It doesn't, crime doesn't have to have just occurred for them to be able to access services. We work with survivors who may have been abused or assaulted 20, 30, 40 years ago, and folks who may have just experienced the victimization. So regardless of where they're at in their healing process, they're able to access support and services from Empower Yolo. We do have a wide range of services here. We also offer restraining order assistance, family legal services. We also are a family resource center, and we can help with housing, access to resources, access to government programs. We can offer assistance with food. We can offer assistance with diapers and hygiene, just basic needs that families may need. So our advocates are supporting folks through the criminal justice process, but they can also support them in other areas as well. And so I wanted to see if there were any questions, any other questions that folks had. All right, let's see. The investigative and medical process to support survivors seems to have come a long way compared to what you've heard from After the Assault podcast. What are your organizations doing to improve even more? Challenges are you experiencing supporting survivors? How can the community be better to support survivors going through an investigation or medical procedure? Anybody want to answer that?
Yeah, I can speak to some of that. I did listen to the podcast, and I have to say I've had that patient multiple times. So while we have come a long way, there is still a lot of inconsistencies patient to patient. We use patient because that's the setting I'm in, a victim survivor. And there are a lot of inconsistencies still. And, you know, it's one of those where as someone who's trying to do better in that field, there's so much you just feel like apologizing for the profession sometimes, you know, because people have had truly horrendous experiences. And unfortunately, I have seen that. So the podcast, I would say, is right on. And I 100% believe that happened. And I can 100% say we're doing better, but I can also say that it's not perfect. And so we are trying now, the next piece again is trying to get that accountability for what the expectation is. But as with anything that's new, you give the information and it gets picked up inconsistently from staff member to staff member. And this is with multiple agencies. This is with police doing better, but not 100%, with healthcare professionals, and that's everyone from nurses to doctors to mid-levels. It's a whole bunch of people you interact with, right? And so we have to have multiple agencies, and then with law enforcement, it's the officer that responds, and then it's the detective. And so all these people here today, we're all people who are really passionate about doing better, but not every single person I work with is passionate about every area that we work in, right? We work with heart attacks and strokes and physical trauma, and we work with victims of crime, and all those things are super important to do really well. And just on the, you know, just being realistic and human, we're not all really good at all of them to the same level. And so we are trying always to do better, and it starts with everybody training and getting that education. And then we're doing monthly meetings with the SART team, and we do look for those bad experiences and those gaps and what we did maybe miss. And so that's what we're doing. I think for me, one of the biggest things that's helped is the monthly meetings with multiple agencies trying to figure out where those holes are.
I think if it's, I'll go. You know, from and I can only speak to Davis PD, but from a law enforcement perspective, and as someone who's listened to the podcast series several times now, you know, a couple of things stood out for me in the podcast series. One was it was someone in administration at, I think it was Citrus Heights PD, who mentioned that you get a wide variety of people from a law enforcement perspective who go to the emergency room. So it's typically someone in patrol. And that, I think it was the chief. So that chief mentioned how you could have someone who just had come from a fatal traffic accident or some other call who's now being dispatched to the hospital. And honestly, you know, everyone in law enforcement, most of us in law enforcement are required to take at least that initial statement in a sexual assault investigation, but not everyone's into it. It's a passion of mine. And so, like Elizabeth said, you know, that's one of the reasons I'm here. But one of the things that I've been trying to do is, so when we have a new officer that joins Davis PD, whether it's someone who's just out of the academy or someone who's been a cop for 20 years, they have to go through what we call our in-house training. So it's kind of learning how to do policing the way Davis Police does policing. Included in that is sexual assault and domestic violence, amongst lots of other policies that we cover. And I actually don't spend that much time going through and the actual formal policy, we talk about it, but I really try and convey to them what my learnings have been now, having been a detective here for 3 years and definitely made my fair share of mistakes and made lots of mistakes in patrol as well. And so I usually start that conversation with them and say, imagine you've just gone through like one of the worst possible things a human being can go through. And now a cop is standing in front of you and asking you to tell them all about it. Like, treat survivors like human beings. It doesn't, trauma-informed interviewing, it's nice that there's formalized process around it, but it doesn't have to be. It's really just going to them and treating them with compassion and making them think that you care and asking them to tell you what they have, what happened, and trying to allow that survivor to express agency in whatever way they're able to in that moment. So everyone goes through that, and then I go out to our briefings. Like just yesterday, I went to a briefing, and I give the same speech in a condensed version also. So kind of that same thing, and hopefully it trickles down. There's a million different things that are involved in the life of a patrol officer, and this is a small portion of it. But I'm hoping that that carries through. The other big learning for me, especially as a detective, is the gap in communication and how important communication is to some survivors. Not all survivors, but some of the survivors on the podcast really talked about how they felt like they got left into a void. They weren't hearing from their investigator. And so I make it a point now when I'm working with a survivor to either communicate directly to them frequently, or as frequently as either they express or I think they want to hear from me, or working through the advocate that's assigned to the case, and just give them updates along the way. I learned a lot in my first year as a detective here, and definitely made some mistakes and could do things better in terms of communicating along the way to one survivor in particular. And so I've learned from that. And maybe it's just a text message that says, "Hey, just wanted to let you know I'm still on the case, no updates, let you know when I learn more." The feedback I've gotten is that it makes a big difference. So that's it.
Any other thoughts or comments from the panelists?
I just wanted to say part of the question was, how can the community better support survivors? And what I've noticed, what survivors often get is blame, second guessing. I think it's important for everybody to believe them. Don't ask why were they drunk. There's a reason alcohol is the #1 date rape drug. Did they say no? That's not a question. And ask the person who raped them, did you get a yes? Did you actually get consent? So it's important to support them by believing them. I think that's very, very important.
And I would absolutely second the whole start by believing the importance of that, because, and we do talk to our staff about that too, like, what skin is it off your teeth to just take their information, just take it. Like, we're not investigators. I don't even have to decipher its validity. Like, it's no skin off your teeth. And as a friend or a support person, again, it's no skin off your teeth, just listen. And then the other thing I really would recommend is the advocate. It sounds really obvious for those of us who know how useful advocates are, but a lot of patients will initially want to decline. Again, you don't want someone else hearing your story. You don't want to disturb someone and cause them to come in. There's a lot of reasons, but the advocates truly are all encompassing resources legally. And that's, again, emergency protective orders, what that means. It might not mean what you think it does. At the Victim Compensation Fund, you may be able to get a security camera through these funds that are available. Law enforcement, forensics, what's the process like? Counseling, they're so knowledgeable. And unfortunately, like I'm not, I wish I knew every single resource and everything about it, but I know, my portion. The cops, the law enforcement that show up at the hospital know their portion, the detectives know theirs. And I really feel like the advocates bridge all of those gaps. So I would really, really, really recommend getting a hold of your local advocacy agency.
Yeah, So I totally agree. And I spent some time, gosh, it's probably been a year or so ago now, sort of reviewing with Selena and with Jackie over at UC Davis Care, kind of an elevator pitch statement for patrol officers to use. It's a mouthful, so if they just get to the gist of it, then I'm happy. But essentially, that kind of what we came away with is, because oftentimes in patrol, the objection I heard is, well, I have my best friend, or I have my significant other, or I have my mom with me, and really I wanted to overcome that objection a little bit and say, like, that's awesome that they're there for you, but let me get an advocate started for you, because advocates are there to come in and tell you that they believe you and they're sorry that happened to you, and ask how they can help you. They are about as objective, as unbiased as someone can be, where other people in your life, they bring different things to that relationship. And so it's just super, super important, super important. And there's a lot of training. It's if you're going to be a DV and SA advocate, it's 80 hours just to do the peer counseling. It's a lot, and it's comprehensive.
If somebody is interested in learning more about volunteering or becoming an advocate with Empower Yolo, we are currently accepting volunteer applications, and that is the first step towards getting involved with our agency. So we do peer counseling training. It's starting at the end of the month. The application is on our website, and so I would encourage you to fill it out and submit it if you are interested. It's a wonderful opportunity to learn how to further support survivors. And I want to thank all of the panelists for being here today. I think one of the things that is unique for us here in Yolo County is that we do work well together, and we do understand the roles that one another have, and it does help us to provide more options and education and support to survivors. And so I want to thank folks for being here, and let survivors know that we're here. If you'd like to reach out, we also have a crisis line that can be available as well. It's 24 hours. You can call and speak to a peer counselor anytime you may need to. And then next week, we will be discussing episodes 4, Case Closed, and episode 5, Living with Trauma. So if you're interested to hear our next panelists discuss those episodes, I encourage you to join us next week. We'll also be announcing a really new, exciting program and service that we'll be launching. So I'm going to leave that as a cliffhanger for you to tune in next week to learn more about our new, exciting program. So thank you all for being here, and feel free to reach out if you're needing any support. Thank you.